This is the World Organic News for the week ending 11th of March 2019. John Moore reporting. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. This week I'm responding to a question. A few weeks back at the community garden, we were in a group discussion about the impacts of climate change. 3% of Tasmania had been ravaged by bushfires. Large parts of the Australian mainland were and still are under drought. And some of those areas in Queensland under drought had just been hit by drought-breaking a weather event so large hundreds of thousands of cattle drowned due to the suddenness and extent of the rainfall. The question which came up in conversation was this: how do you convince the doubters? The individual asking the question had been in discussion at his local golf club. The club is on the coastal plain near the town of Devonport. Tasmania is the island state of Australia. Every school child is taught that Tassie was once attached to the mainland, but melting ice that marked the start of the current interglacial period caused sea levels to rise, and the island was created. Starting at this point, the gentleman then went on to point out that the body of water separating Australia from the mainland, Bass Strait, would widen as the planet warmed, melting ice, expanding water as it heated, and so on. That final step was where the listeners had a problem. Past sea level rises were okay, another one seemed beyond their grasp. He was, of course, using a logical argument. In Tasmania, the idea of climate change is closely associated with one political party, the Greens. Originally, the United Tasmania Group, formed in 1972, they evolved into the Greens Party, the world's first such organisation. They arose to fight an expansion of the hydroelectric scheme in the state, which had proposed a dam which was going to flood an area of outstanding natural biodiversity and beauty. There were federal implications and intrusions into the process. The mainland telling us what we can and can't do with our state, that sort of thing. The state divided into pro and anti-green, and there is still an undercurrent of this in the state, and the dam was not built, by the way. Not surprisingly, this had political implications. Even though all this started back in 1972, several generations of resistance to and support for environmental programs has resulted in a divided state. Climate change and the more extreme prophecies of what it meant simply widened the gap between pro and anti. The pro-Greens did themselves no favours by constantly implying the end of the world was coming and coming quickly. While all this is a local summary, the patterns have been repeated around the world. Especially in North America and Australia, the right of politics, increasingly the far right, are rabid opponents to the idea of climate change as a thing, let alone doing anything to change the current situations. The fossil fuel industry, following the pattern set by tobacco industry's legal and, in inverted commas, scientific defence of its income, have been able to find useful fools to do its bidding. This has tended to reinforce the climate change is a marker of political understanding thought process. Or to be a little bit more blunt, if I can claim climate change is not happening or is natural, others will know I'm not a greenie. This brings me back to the original question: how do you convince the doubters? Or perhaps better framed, how do we convince people of what's happening when they seem not to see what's before their own eyes? If we accept that climate change for many is not a matter of science but a matter of self-description, then no amount of logic, evidence or science in general will ever get them to change their position. And without a change in position, getting the numbers to elect individuals willing to take the necessary steps will not occur. The other great divide the Greens versus argument created was with farmers. Early attempts to stem deforestation led to legislation banning tree clearing. This led to some media exposure of the state controlling private property and the loss of rights without compensation. And there is something to this, and not at the same time. Instead of legislating alone, some sort of education program showing the value, the economic value, to a farm of some tree cover and a financial incentive to maintain the trees would have had far less negative effects. The Greens at the time were behaving with the single-minded focus of a religious zealot, and many saw the passing of the above-mentioned type of legislation as for everyone's good, even if someone suffered in the implementation. The greater good argument. Too bad if you were the one whose land was no longer would be allowed to be cleared. So many of those emotional and politically wedded to resistance to climate change ideas believe themselves to be on the same side of the divide as the farmers. Now, in inverted commas, the farmers are not a homogeneous group, but that doesn't matter in this case. It is to our advantage that they are seen as such. This will become obvious as we proceed. I find the best way to change someone's opinion is to find a like-minded individual who has already done so. The thrust goes something like this. Your peer used to think just like you. They have changed their opinion, and they tell me it's because of X, Y, and Z. Change the subject and come back to it later in the conversation when the idea has had time to settle. This may take a few moments or it may take a few months, but change does work its way through eventually, to most people. To the matter of climate change, and I hope you see where we're going, most people who hold the opinions against science don't care about the science. Their belief is a psychological position. So arguing the science is talking at cross purposes with them. You may believe you've ended up on the same page, but you'll both be in different books. The way into their world is the way to change. As I stated above, most of the urban and suburban types fighting against useful change see only increased taxes, a system that benefits the financial traders who wrecked the world economy back in 2007, and a fall in their own living standards. That continuation along the path will lead to the same outcome is irrelevant to their understanding of the world. Now, some people will never change their position. Understanding this will save us a huge amount of effort and psychic capital. I would argue, though, that the majority of people are open to change when it is in their benefit and saves them from harm. So I use farmers as an example. There have been a few key points that matter in these discussions that I've had. The first is the change in timings. Silage and hay being cut earlier than a generation ago. And then I argue that farmers are practical people and won't jump on a bandwagon of change for the sake of it, as they are trying to make a living in the real world. Droughts, flooding rains, storm systems are all affecting farming and food prices. We had a cyclone in Australia a few years back that destroyed a large portion of the banana industry. And those fruits, and yes, I know they're technically herbs, but those fruits went from a couple of dollars a kilo to $25 and more in places a kilo. This is a direct-to-the-hip pocket example of what one storm can do. The other really good example of change is the wine industry. In Australia, wine growers and large corporations that bottle wine are moving further south to establish vineyards. Why? Because it is too hot at harvest time, and some vintners have 130-odd years of records to prove that the change is getting worse. Setting up a vineyard is not an inexpensive thing, nor is it done lightly. This is a thing to point out. In the same way that the US wine industry is moving north from California to Oregon and even Washington, and in the UK grapes are being grown to maturity. I even saw them growing in Ireland. Not your typical climate for grapes. I'm sure there are other examples of this sort of change. The point is, the most practical people in the world, farmers, are reacting to the changes they see on the ground. They do not have ideological nor political reasons for doing so. They are dealing with reality year in and year out. If they can sense a change, then maybe it's actually happening. And that's the best argument I've come up with so far, and it seems to work. I have seen the lights come on in people's eyes. They don't have a reason to know these things until they are placed before them. All the news covers are the natural disasters and the political infighting, and neither of these will change enough people's mind to have a political effect. So I hope this has been useful. It has certainly helped me to clarify my thinking in the writing and recording of it. If you have any thoughts, email me, redocean112@gmail.com. There's a link in the show notes. And on that note, I'll draw this episode to a conclusion. Remember, decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. If you're still thinking about starting a podcast, there's checklists available over at John Moore Podcasting Services, link again in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week.